Hi to everyone. Following up with our civic tornadoes encounters, which are a joint effort between Red Lad and the World Movement of Democracy. We have today a chat with David Riveros, a Paraguayan activist and director of an organization called Reacción. David, thanks for agreeing to have this chat with Rioda and with me today. And why don't you introduce yourself and Reacción, just for start?
Thank you, Gina. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity of sharing what's happening in Paraguay. And as you said, my name is David Riveros Garcia. I am the executive director of Reacción. Reacción is a youth-led anti-corruption organization from the east of Paraguay, the eastern front that bordered with Brazil. So we're in the so-called tribal border area between Ciudad del Este, Foz de Iguaçu in Brazil, and Puerto Iguaçu in Argentina, which is a unique area in the Americas for a variety of reasons. Reacción is at the intersection of grassroots work, activism, and the other very important aspect of work these days, which is data analytics and strategic nonviolent action in order to do some sort of constructive conflict with government authorities and create space for change by leading, by youth leadership. As Gina knows, as an old friend, we actually met when Reacción was just about to start 10 years ago. It all started with youth-led activism in schools and fighting corruption in the education sector. That has continued as the main area of work that we do, and we're very proud of it. And today, I hope I can share a bit of insight and most of the anecdotes of the past 4 months working with other civil society actors in my country to, in a way, push for certain reforms and secure transparency in these very troublesome times. So thank you for the invitation and for the time.
No, thanks again to you and to Ryota that is joining us today also. Just to give a set of a context for the audience that it will be watching this video, just let us know what is the impact of COVID crisis and its management in Paraguay's situation related with corruption and governance. So how is the situation right now, and what can you tell us about the sense of the context that you are having there?
Okay, so for the people that don't know much about Paraguay, Paraguay is a very small country comparatively because it's in the middle of giants of Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia. A comparison would be, it's about the size of Germany in continental Europe. We have a population of about 7 million people, according to the last census. We are so far considered one of the good examples in the region in terms of managing the COVID-19 crisis. However, that is not really the case. Although we are portrayed as an example, the reality is we have no other option but managing the situation as best as we can, because the capacity of our healthcare system is quite non-existent. So the numbers that for other countries could be manageable or even low on a comparative basis, for Paraguay would be the beginning of a national tragedy. And so we're always, at any moment, just a couple weeks away from becoming a regional tragedy. For instance, today we have returned back to full lockdown in a region of the country in the east where I live. We border Brazil and Argentina in the tribal border area in South America. And we went back to full lockdown because the spikes started to go up in terms of contagion and the community circulation of the virus. And in the past 4, instead of using the time to actually build the temporary infrastructure that we need to manage comparatively bigger numbers, we have had a series of corruption scandals. Paraguay, as many other countries, borrowed a lot of money, in our case, $1.6 billion, just to face the crisis. That money was allocated in different ways. So part of it went to buy the medicine and the respirators and try to build the temporary infrastructure, so the tents and other sort of special rooms for the people that would eventually get ill. Another big chunk went to the economic recovery. So a lot of cash transfers without any conditions were made and are still being made by the government. And then, of course, the government had to have some sort of chunk of money to still pay the public employees. The situation 4 months later is very complicated. The amount of corruption that was evidenced by the press and by civil society organizations has, ironically, become another sort of excuse for people who would want to wish the virus out of existence, because, as it has happened in many other countries in the world, fake news and also certain strands of libertarianism have really empowered voices through social media that believe the measures to protect the community and the society from the expansion of the virus are against their personal freedom and represent authoritarian steps against the freedom of people. So we have experienced that as well. I think the other very important factor that we also share with neighbor countries, people have come to feel disgusted with corruption, although I think for the first time since I have a memory, people actually feel the effects of corruption. So corruption has always been this abstract thing. People are stealing, money is being allocated for private gain, that sort of examples. But since the crisis started, people realized, oh, we do not have enough hospital rooms or beds or medicine. We don't really have enough doctors. Oh, we don't even have internet connection so that people that cannot go to schools these days will have a way to continue their education. We do not have enough resources to subsidize the poorest of the poor for even a couple months, because it just happens that the structure of taxation in our country is so regressive and privileges a few small sectors that we don't really have resources to even finance very unusual needs in terms of education and healthcare. So all of that, all those abstract things that we have been working on and campaigning against for years, now have come home to the skin of people. And then we realize that, I think, in the face of all this rhetoric of transparency and indeed certain reforms to achieve it, when with all this transparency we still have impunity, that's just a disgusting way of insulting democracy and the citizenry, because it just shows and goes to show that yes, you could have access to information and contracts and resources and how we manage it, but still those that you expose that are corrupt and that are stealing from the people will not go to jail and won't be prosecuted. And that's something that we now, I think, have come full grasp with. And I think that's what has catalyzed action between civil society actors and the community.
Great. You give us a lot of insights on something that I'm not very sure if the other countries are actually, or the other citizens in the region are seeing is that this huge link between what is happening in COVID and the previous corruption corruption states that we actually have in the region. So it's very important to have a concrete example in one place where that is actually highlighting and creating all these analysis from citizens that at some point, due to the fear that people is living, and even though they are facing problems, they are trying to prefer those measures that are trying to protect them instead of seeing what is happening and why is this affecting us so hard. So it's very important to see it like from a concrete example. Riota, I don't know if you want to follow up.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to hear that, often COVID-19 crisis is, we consider the challenge and, give us a lot of headache. But at the same time, like you were saying, David, it has provided opportunity. It presented opportunity to really connect the people's life and what the democratic governance means. And I think you have taken very important opportunity here. And this conversation about corruption and governance with the Red Lad, you, David, and World Movement comes timely because a few weeks ago on July 15th, actually the World Economic Forum published an article saying that the COVID-19 pandemic has created the condition and the environment in which corruption can actually flourish. And this is something that many of us were, worried about. As Gina pointed out earlier, the efforts to fight corruption by you, David, and your colleagues in civil society has been very impressive over the last 4 months. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that, because we don't often talk about victories. We often talk about fear and the challenges and dangers. So, I understand that you won 2 different lawsuits against government, forcing the government officials to be transparent about public spending and public assets. You also got you also got your Congress to back off from the law that would decriminalize, I guess, the publication of the false documents by government officials. And people calling this Paraguay's transparency spring. And so give us a little bit more about how you went about this, and why you decided to actually use the legal remedies to fight against corruption, when you were saying just now, public is mobilizing themselves and raising awareness about corruption. Normally the civil society tend to focus on raising the public awareness around the issues as opposed to strategic litigation type of approach. So I wanted to understand your, sort of strategic thinking, why you went to legal approach as opposed to public mobilization, public awareness, information sharing, naming, shaming.
Thank you, Riota, and thank you, Gina. The public procurement aspect that you mentioned, Riota, is fundamental in the things that we have been working on for the past 5 years at least. Paraguay in 2014 became the 100th nation to have an access to information law. We came very late into the transparency game. And as a latecomer, I think the government tried to compensate. So in a couple of years, 2014 and 2015, we had this massive wave of open government data, public procurement, transparency, and a series of legislation trying to improve the way in which government pushes information and data out, with the hope that that could create accountability at some point. Paraguay, ironically, very ironically, has one of the best open contracting data standard application in the world, which goes back to what I mentioned. It's not enough when we have transparency if we don't have impunity going down and the corrupt people going to jail. So I wanted to mention this in context because it really informs the way in which we have worked through these years, and how in doing that kind of community work and building alliances in the long term, we reached this point in which this sort of victories became possible. 5 years ago, to think about suing the Controller General of the country so that his institution would publish the sworn financial statements of public employees, which should be part of the transparency law, that would be completely mad. People would laugh at you for the very mentioning of the possibility. Today, that's something that has happened. And then to even think that you could win as a group of NGOs working together a case in the Supreme Court that would mandate the publication of about 10 years of those sworn statements from public employees in very high positions in government, that would be absurd. Right now, as we speak, thousands of those sworn statements are being published online. And a group of people voluntarily are working on analyzing the information through a lot of technical methods to extract the data, and, as has happened in the past month, expose the people that has got, well, on average about 100 and 200% increase in their wealth, not income, but the wealth that they have in a couple years, which is impossible if you look at what they were making. So since 2014, I think most organizations were really focusing on, let's try for citizens to be aware of what this access to information law allow us now. Let's contribute critically with government to expand capacities so that they can also use the data they're providing to improve and reform public policy. And patience, in the sense that we in Reacción use it, the constructive and critical impatience in which we work, steadily and slowly wore down and became scarce. And I think the same has happened with NGOs like Semillas, which I know Gina knows, and IDEA, who were fundamental in the work that we have done in the past months. So with them, and I want to emphasize and stress this, as a group, we could channel this opportunity when we already thought that advocating publicly would not work, would not be effective, because we have been trying that, exhausting the methods, as other people would put it. We have also tried mobilizations in the past, which are not possible today because of the conditions of the virus. And so legal action at the end that was very strategically placed and with pressure from different audiences in this case. So in the case of IDEA or IDEA, however you want to name them, they were incredibly good, and they actually are one of the, as an organization, they're the fathers or the, better put, the parents of the access to information law. They have been working for years in strategic litigation. And so we saw as a group that work of years of doing litigation and the work that we do with the youth audience in universities and high schools and with a younger public, with a different way of reaching that audience, added to that strategic litigation capacity and added to the pressure that we got through Semillas and other friends in contacting and persuading very famous and influential journalists, credible journalists, to support our work, all summed up, allowed for the possibility of what happened. So then when IDEA said, we have this situation, you have worked on that as well for the past couple of years, we need someone as an organization or as an individual that could be courageous enough in this case to sue the Comptroller General. We will support you, we will defend the case as lawyers, but we need someone other than us. And we gladly accepted, so we sued and we won. So that was already a precedent. On the other hand, the case for the Supreme Court was a case that IDEA has been working on for 2 years. It was almost 3 already, so I could say 3 years. And it was the request for accessing information made by a journalist, Juan Quilescano, who had asked the same sworn financial statements 3 years ago, and who was denied that. So they appealed with IDEA's defense, and they reached the Supreme Court. And then, as we know, that got postponed, and the treatment of it was affected eventually by the crisis until the case came about. Coincidentally, the case against the Comptroller General and the case against the, considered by the Supreme Court happened within a few weeks of difference. And so the strategic moment, as we say in Spanish, la coyuntura, was so auspicious for concentrating all our resources. So we literally switched everything we had, all our focus, our communication efforts, our energy and time and resources on this, betting we could win. And so that happened. So the first thing then I would try to, extrapolate for the experiences we had is that the long-term work is something that we usually neglect in achieving certain victories. We tend to crystallize victories in the moment we reach them and believe that certain things coincided in a causal way, not casually, but causal way. And then we forget and underestimate the years of work that it took for organizations like IDEA to build that capacity and create the points or identify the points within the system in which they can influence with their knowledge and know-how. The time it took for Reacción to build this community of youth leaders that is credible and that can get a message viral because of the content and really potential for impact. And the opportunity that Semillas afforded us contacting this very well-known and credible journalists that were also persuaded by this moment, that they saw the opportunity to gain this, to turn this situation into a victory that could help us to move forward the transparency agenda. And yet, we do not believe this is enough. In fact, the day we won this case as a group, the celebration was not really that long, because we knew that all the paperwork and the information that was going to be published, if once again that just remained as paper and people would not feel that at this instance, transparency could turn into accountability and people could actually get what they deserve for what they did and how they used and misappropriated public resources, then we really risk frustrating citizens and making them hopeless and lose then the potential and support for other fights for transparency. So that's, I think, one way to summarize it. The second and very important thing that we learned talking with journalists is that very important news outlets in our country, I'm not saying they're comparable to others like in Brazil, the Folha, or the United States, but those very big news outlets have little, or in most cases, no resources assigned to investigative journalism. So the news cycle, which everywhere now is very quick and changing, the news outlets cannot manage to go deeper into certain situations because, one, they don't have the resources invested, and two, most of the journalists were not aware of the basic tools that the access to information law afforded them or how to use the data that is available. So ever since, we have strengthened or focused on training journalists and people that do research into using the data and the open and the transparency platforms that the government provides wherever they are good, so they can monitor the way these resources for the crisis are being allocated. And the third point, and this is, I think, the last, that I think very important to notice, the global south is characterized by very centralized human capital and state capacity, which doesn't really decentralize well, and not only in the reach and capacity of government to do a variety of basic things, but also in the way civil society can respond outside of capitals. So in Paraguay, we have a very good, still nascent, but very good ecosystem of civil society organizations in Asunción. They can do a lot when they work together. But in Ciudad del Este, we are virtually alone as a civil society organization trying to fight corruption and promoting transparency and good governance. So this state inability to execute its own budget. Last year, the Ministry of Healthcare could, in a very normal, anything now is not normal, before the COVID era, it only reached 40% of total execution of its budget. That's a very normal year. So now suppose, and this goes back to what you mentioned, Ryota, in public procurement, suppose now all of a sudden you have an injection of hundreds of millions of dollars that you have to execute in record time, so less than 4 months. You have to buy, you have to create the contracts, and you have to monitor the deliverance of a lot of public goods that you need with urgency. But you were not able, historically, to execute half of your budget. Corruption then is just, as you mentioned, is just there out for the taking. It's just, it's served on a silver plate. So the state capacity is fundamental, but also civil society capacity. We're only 3 NGOs in this example, not the only ones in Paraguay. A lot of other NGOs have done very good work in their own areas of expertise. But when we think back about the ecosystem in the country, there's no way that in the south corner of Paraguay, where the situation is harder, the economy is poorer, and hospitals are much scarcer than in our region, people would be able to monitor whatever is being used and how that's happening. So the combination of the 3 points, first, recognizing the long work that it takes for the possibility of change to happen and not crystallizing that in one moment. Second, to really work with journalists that are credible, they're willing to speak out and to put certain things on the agenda. And third, to remind ourselves that change is not possible when the capacity of the state is low, which needs help, and when civil society is not ready to cooperate, but there's also no focus in increasing the number of actors and the capacity of civil society to be participative, to participate in the process of co-creating change and then defending citizens' rights. Then when we don't have the combination of those 3 factors, I think a lot of challenges that are still to come in the post-COVID-19 era will be very troublesome and hard to overcome.
Great. No, these 3 points are very important. But let me just ask one more thing. You start talking about how now the corruption issue is touching on everyone's life, and people start realizing this connection between the corruption and their life. The story that you gave us just now and the 3 points that you mentioned basically talk about 3 actors: legal community, in media community, and the civil society community. Yet where's the people? I mean, don't they need to be part of this process now that there's the general awareness of these connections of corruption and their life. What are the efforts to connect those dots? How are you bringing the community of people into your broader advocacy? Especially given that, there's lockdown. That means that people are not generally coming out to the street. I'm not saying that street protest is only thing that civil society and the community organizing do, but it is good, important component. When people are not coming out, we cannot organize a street protest to really mobilize critical mass. How are we engaging with people around these issues?
And just a small comment plus that is that the other mechanism that citizens use sometimes to punish corrupt politicians are elections. But then I know that in Paraguay the elections were postponed. So how do you manage to join all those dots and actually bring in the people in this analysis?
Okay, I'll do my best to answer those. I've always been in favor of this argument that participation, as much as we romanticize it, is very costly in a variety of ways that we do not bring to the forefront. For instance, to participate in meaningful ways to monitor public resources, we first have to talk about the cost, the information cost that it takes for people to understand how public procurement works, where to find the information. Hopefully, if they find the information, then if they understand it. So we are making a lot of assumptions already by that moment. The person knows about the legislation, the person has access to the internet and can go to the public procurement portal. The person knows how to filter data and probably work with the worksheets in a way. And then the person knows where to, present their grievances or who to send the evidence the person found to expose corruption. So being very aware of how prohibitively expensive it is to participate and what a privilege that actually is. In Reacción, because in this case, I cannot really talk about the work we've done with IDEA and Semillas. In Reacción, we've always worked very intentionally on a long time frame. How, as Ryota asked, how did we make people participate, young people in this case, in this whole process that I've just mentioned? So they don't participate perhaps as much very close to this sort of scenarios where the situations and the equilibrium changes so fast, the decisions, in this case, by the people that represent these communities, in our case, our organization, have to make a lot of decisions quickly, trying the best and for the best to achieve the change that we commit or that we have committed with the community we try to serve. The participation happens in the whole process before that. We have been very intentional in Reacción 10 years ago when I met Gina and I was 18 years old, that we would not be the type of organization that would become very visible or that would score very high in log frames when we worked with organizations like now or major donor and the main one, the National Endowment for Democracy. And I think we were very lucky at that because the local manager that works with us, the Señor Enrique Bravo, he understood this and he bet on an organization that would focus on creating the local capacity, working with youth with no very visible impact in the short term, believing the theory of change that I had presented, that in 5 or 10 years, this community would be big enough and strong enough and well-informed and with the skills that would make the cost of political inaction very prohibitive for local authorities. So the way in which collective action in that way works and achieves impact is by increasing the cost of political inaction. So the mayor or the minister or even the president is not so much trying to collaborate or agree with us. He or she do not have the option to, because it would be so harmful for him or her in public opinion, because he notices or she notices there is a majority already informed about it that is following the topic. So I think that the difficult part is actually the process before the situation. How do you maintain engagement and interest on such topics for a long time within a very disciplined and concentrated community of people, to the point that people know higher up in the political rankings that if a group of organizations, or in this case Reacción, put something on the table, they will not give up until they make it true. So this is not going to be a fashion thing. We're going to raise this because now it is important and people will like or post and share it and make it viral. This is something that we're taking because we're now famous for taking something and not leaving it alone until we get somewhere and the community is there. I think that's the harder part. And Reacción is not unique in this. I think what we have done very early, at a very young age also, is look at the examples outside. So the civil rights movement, the whole theory of nonviolent conflict, started by Gandhi and then expanded by Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend James Lawson in the United States, Mr. Lewis, who just passed away days ago. That history of working without any visibility or impact, training people to be nonviolent when demanding change, and bringing this discipline and focus on a topic for such a length of time that when the time comes, it becomes inevitable not to really face a larger group of people that are committed to something, then that's really what's making change. And I think participation should be understood in those terms. If someone is participating in something, which is not just retweeting and sharing and liking or commenting, participation in its most fundamental definition for us means, did you learn something new about government in this whole process of going against the Comptroller General or getting the sworn financial statements published? Did you learn how it works? Why is it important to have these documents in the public? Can you use them on a basic, very intuitive level to demand something else? Can you use the sworn financial statements perhaps to get your principal's financial statement and compare it? Or your, what's another good example? The university rector, the person in charge, the dean in the university that is being paid, to see if you suspect him or her of any corruption. So I think that's where participation actually should happen. And at the end, when you have a community, even messages that are very complicated and maybe not so trivial to digest have a bigger opportunity of becoming viral, just because the community takes a message, which is something we do. We ask them to share them, and it matters what is the membership of that community, because maybe nobody knows about me and wouldn't care the least if I post something, but this very young leader in a high school believes what we do and shares it, and then her peers share it because they trust this person. And that's how the message then becomes important, when they bring the conversation. So there's, as everyone says, there is no easy task in this, and there is no shortcuts. We tend to focus too much on the victories and not on the previous hard work that is not and never is individual. That could not happen without community. So I'm trying to emphasize, as you probably noticed in my responses, how important it is to value and strive for a group of people that might not be very popular or visible in the long or in the short term, but they can become much more in the long term, and that we should make the sacrifice of not being perhaps famous too quickly or visible in exchange for the potential impact that trusting future generations and a community of people that build their own leadership there are to come. So I think that is a very long response to Ryota's question, but I don't know if I have reached Gina's question.
Oh, this is great. I mean, Gina's question was, how this situation will be, it's already complicated enough, yet the election's been postponed, and what does it mean to your movement in activism? Right, Gina? Yeah.
Yes, no, I think it's okay. The idea that you gave us, and just I take especially two things of this answer and the previous one is the importance of persistence and being patient. And I think that this is very, very important because citizens and especially civil society that look forward changes every day, that has been spending years to promote those changes. Sometimes we get tired and we get upset and because we don't get the changes. But at the end, the main message that you send us is that we need to persist in our actions and to actually maybe have some like active patience. I mean, you can have to be patient, but also being active in what you're trying to do. And the other thing that I take from what you say, which I find really interesting, is the issue of that the importance is not actually the publicity of what you do, but the idea is just to take over and just not look for popularity, but for looking forward the long-term changes that you want. And that is a powerful message for civil society, that sometimes we look for immediate changes or at least short-term changes, and also just to publicize everything that we do, and at some point what we need is just to wait up for the changes to arrive. So I think that those two things are very relevant for civil society, and also all the ideas on participation are very important because it has exactly the same basis. So participation is just a small drop that actually will erode the bad things that citizens want to change. So I appreciate that.
I want to be clear about one point, however. Communication at some point in the process is very critical. If something that we have done also intentionally, because as you work in civil society, you create expectations about the impact you could get. And if you cannot manage the expectations you create, you are creating your own troubles for the future.
Sure.
I cannot stress enough how important it is to have meaningful debate online and how certain things should be fought for. But there should be a balance, and every organization and every area of activism understands when to tip the balance or when to do something less than the other.
Yeah.
We cannot let the trolls and the people that promote fake news going freely around the social networks saying whatever they want about certain topics. Not something that we should do. We don't encourage that. At the same time, I don't think, and I want to be very clear about this, I do not think that the world changes because you won an argument online. It is fair and needed that we expose our points and try to be as empathetic with the other side as we can, and respectful and tolerant, as long as they're not Nazis or fascists, in which case I am in total support of people that really go against that sort of mentality and philosophy. But change really happens in the streets, talking to people, trying to build things that take longer than the chemicals you would get from feeling that you won an argument online about some troll that just has this miserable life, and all that that person can actually get in retribution in one day is making other people feel miserable. So we should be very selective and strategic in about the moments in which we go full mode communication, like we did in this last stage to achieve these victories. But I think that should be the 20% in very strategic moments. The rest should be community and spending time with people and understanding what is really valuable. And the exercise of humility that civil society seldom understands, in my perspective, and with the hindsight of 10 years, having had the privilege of meeting people like Gina, people that had much more experience than myself, and the way other organizations have worked, we have this lack of humility in terms of creating structures and organizations that make us individuals in their leadership very visible and in a way thus powerful to inflict changes. But we seldom focus on creating or using those platforms to bring young leaders and invest even the credibility we have achieved in a way or built in community, to transfer that to other people and entrust them with the possibilities for future change. Every country you go to, we have the same names and the same NGOs that have been working for the past decade or two. And there is this elite of civil society organizations, most of which, and I include myself at this point, do not talk the language of youth, cannot transmit the urgency in terms that the new groups and generations can understand and mobilize as a result. And at the end of the day, some organizations have come about and then perished, linked to the one person and founder that has established that organization, without ever creating more spaces or renovating civil society or pushing for other people to take new roles. And I think the donor community also has a role there. And in the case of Paraguay, I've seen that. The only example that I know so far is, and I'm not saying this because this is a world moving for democracy, but because I really recognize the work that Mr. Enrique has done in Paraguay, looking out for new organizations and a nascent civil society that seldom gets to get the support from international donors or the capacity to reach them with their proposals, simply because nobody in civil society, the traditional one, ever cared to spread that capacity, to create spaces and an ecosystem in which more groups and NGOs could be born and grow and cooperate. So I think now that I've been working on this for 10 years, we have an urgent need, if we want to fight corruption and if we want to improve governance, to also trust with humility into what the next generation is capable of doing. And perhaps that's the biggest inheritance that we can leave to them, that we took a step aside in the moment, in the right moment, and we didn't stay there until we're so old that we have monopolized the whole civil society sector, and it's always the same voices that are being heard. Otherwise, we're just the same thing as the political parties we criticize and the elites in the private and public sector that we also go against. Well, I think that's sort of my final message, something that really worries me and that we're trying to change in our local community.
Yeah, thank you, David, for that. This is exactly something that my team in the World Movement have been talking about. You know, whenever we go to the international conferences on democracy, you know, there are certain gurus, if I can call them. And how do we expand this guru, you know, the circle? But at the same time, I have to say, I don't think young people are waiting for old guys to give them a space. They're already expanding their own space and engaging very actively with new energy, new way of engaging new issues. So I'm not too worried that there's a bit of generational gaps here in our community. I think someone once told me that each generation has to find its own battle.
Yeah.
And I think younger generation, if I can call them that way, younger generation has already found their own fight at the moment, and they are already doing that very actively. So I'm very hopeful for that. But I think the communication of a community of democracy promoters do need to be more, have an open ears to different voices that are coming and emerging around the community. So thank you so much for reminding us on this.
Yeah, the same here. I was also thinking about how important is sustainability of these long-term actions, and then youth involvement is the only thing that can actually let that sustainability to be bring their fruits at the way and the time they really have to. So this has been very good, David. I think that at some point we will need another scenario to talk about this social network participation and how trolls and how this hatred language and things have been taking over the fora, the more globalized and democratic fora that we should have, that is internet, that now is actually being completely opposite. So many thanks for this, and that's another talk that we will have at some point with maybe another youth that can teach us a lot about that. And thank you for this time for us, which has been really important.